So, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon here from Uganda. My name is Lynn Komugisha, for those of you who are meeting me for the first time, and I hope it is a good morning in the US where you people are. Glad to have you on Civic Space TV's Uganda Diaspora Show. Today's topic is a very interesting one. We are looking at US-Africa relations, but making a case for Uganda human rights and governance, but also in light of the recent developments in regard to US-Africa relations. This day we have Dr. Helen Epstein, author and human rights activist. We have Edgar Tabaro. Edgar Tabaro is a lawyer. We also have Dr. Daniel Kawuma, who is the National Unity Platform USA leader, as well as Miriam Kyomugasho. Very glad to have you today. Now, maybe just giving us a brief background. The US-Uganda relations date way back 1962, after independence and after, of course, dealing with all the issues that the country endured then. President Museveni came into power in 1986, and after decades of internal strife, there was some, relative political stability thereabouts, and economic growth, and also some significant human rights, governance, and democracy deficits now exist as we speak. And those are some of the issues that the US has had with Uganda, particularly governance and human rights. And for that matter, the relationship was on the rise at some point. It is currently a bit strained. But when we saw the recent US-Africa summit take place, there was some sort of, I would want to say, hope that perhaps this strained relationship could come down. But let's get into it. I want to begin with you, Ms. Helen. As a human rights activist, as an author, as a researcher, with all the issues that surround Uganda-US relations, what do you think is the problem? Is it because of the human rights record that is fast declining, or is it because the democracy has equally been challenged in Uganda, but also maybe because we're looking elsewhere for partnerships. We're looking elsewhere. We're looking to China. We're looking to Russia, and perhaps trying to solve our own problems as an African country.
Yeah. So you're asking really, where do US-Uganda relations stand now? Is that what you're asking? And what is the situation? It's kind of hard to tell, to be honest. Very, very mixed signals coming through. The human rights situation has never been perfect since, in Uganda, even since independence, there have been problems, as we all know. But even early on, after Museveni took over, it's true that in the south of the country, there was stability, there was economic growth, there was not a whole lot of democracy, but a lot of people were pretty happy because after all the turmoil of the Amin and Obote years, it seemed as though Museveni had really brought a true change in the history of the country. But the problem was that in the north and the east of Uganda at that time, the things were not so bright. Even from the beginning of Museveni's reign, there were serious human rights abuses committed by the army in the north and east, and that's where the former militaries of Amin and Obote had come from. And so the army did commit looting and torture and so on up there. It was documented by Amnesty International and others. And so, but this was very much, the area was cordoned off, and it was very hard to get information out of there. And diplomats and people in the South were kind of happy to, just didn't really understand what was going on. Then rebel movements grew up, and there was a war between Joseph Kony and the government and so on. It lasted 27 years, and it was very, very brutal. But the diplomats throughout that period and until very recently were under the illusion that Uganda was this island of stability in a region of, despite all the problems in the north, despite all the problems that Uganda was also causing in neighboring countries, backing rebel groups that invaded Rwanda, for example, that were backing the rebels in southern Sudan, backing rebels in Congo and so on, and contributing to the mayhem that was going on all around in that region, even though Uganda itself, at least southern Uganda, seemed kind of stable. So I still don't know whether the international community has kind of woken up to the reality of that Museveni's been a troublemaker all along. But they certainly are aware of what's happened, especially since 2018, when Bobi Wine began to rise up and participate in all of these election campaigns and draw huge support all over the country. And the crackdown really since then has been very public and very very gruesome and on a very, very wide scale. And I think that has been an embarrassment for the West as it's gotten a lot of publicity, partly because of his charisma, Bobi Wine's charisma and his popularity all over the world, but also because of the particularly well-documented, thanks to Ugandan activists, and gruesome nature of the abuses against people, the torture, the murder, and so on, that the security forces have committed, and the abductions, of course. So where do we stand? I don't know. I think a lot of people were very depressed that Museveni was invited personally by our UN ambassador, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, to end the African Leaders Summit. That sends a very discouraging message to people like us, that we're back to a Cold War situation where as long as you're on our side, it doesn't matter what you do. And I don't know. I'm appalled, but I don't know what else to say.
Right. Thank you very much, Helen, for that. I want to ask Daniel Kawuma. Daniel, you are the National Unity Platform leader in the US, and I'm asking myself, suddenly the rise of and the popularity of Robert Kyagulanyi on the global scene, as he highlights the human rights situation in the country, could it be the reason the US-Uganda relations are being strained, or have these human rights violations been there before, and so we are capitalizing on them as the National Unity Platform?
First of all, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel, and thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to see my friend Helen, Miriam, and others on this platform. So I think, like Helen explained, this situation did not start with Bobi Wine. We have seen this all through Kizza Besigye's campaigns. I think it's pretty much just a revolving door, with Museveni clamping down on dissent the longer he has been in power. So I think if you look at the human rights situations in Uganda, those of us who have been in the United States for a long time, I feel we have been protesting about the same things over and over again. We've been providing the same petitions over and over again. The situation hasn't changed. We see what happens with each election cycle. There's violence, there's clamping down on opposition leaders who are jailed. And then after the election, there's no clear winner of the election. So this did not start with Honorable Kyagulanyi. I think the only change is the growing use of social media, where the eyes of the world have been opened to the atrocities that are happening in Uganda, which before were not visible to the world, because we know what they do during elections. They shut down the internet, but now social media has kind of helped in a certain way to provide some transparency in what's happening in our country, Uganda. But as far as the U.S. relations with Uganda, I think this one can only be looked at from the geopolitical perspective. I think the U.S. is very concerned about the growing influence of China and Russia in Africa. And this summit, which just happened in Washington, D.C., to me, was a business summit. I think the United States wants to have more business, more connections, and more attachment to the continent of Africa, no matter what the consequences are. If you look at the invitation list, really, it shows that human rights were not a priority at all. It was all about growing American influence and competing with China and Russia. So it's a major setback overall to human rights advocates for the things that we stand for and we fight for each and every day, because for these leaders who come to the United States, this visit gives them legitimacy for everything that they are doing in their countries. And we have seen the pictures that are being shared by the government official sites in Uganda, showing that Museveni was officially invited by Biden and, of course, standing side to side with Biden and the power and might of the United States. So once those images filter back to the population in Uganda, it shows that whatever all the efforts that are being made are pretty much, it's a major setback from my perspective. And I agree that most of us are disappointed, and not just Ugandans. Have been attending many events, side events at the US-African Summit from fellow brothers and sisters from Chad, from Sierra Leone, from Egypt, from Sudan, Zimbabwe. Everyone is not happy with the situation and the message that is being sent by the Biden administration. So overall, I think this summit is a major setback to human rights in our country.
Right, interesting there. And to think that we have been looking to the US, to help sort the issues that face the country. Now the Biden administration is being, questioned, is being looked at as not paying attention to actually the worries of most Ugandans. And they're saying that despite the Ugandan government's a long history of abuse and repression, the U.S. has yet to reevaluate its relationship or call out President Museveni for the lack of accountability. That notwithstanding, Edgar Tabaro, you're into international relations and the like. But as things are at the moment, with the recent summit that concluded, and with the glaring questions of human rights abuses against the government, against President Museveni and his people, do you think the U.S. relations really are anything to worry about?
I really don't see anything that has markedly changed in the relations between Uganda, the DC, and Kampala. It's always been like this. It's been, the constant has been American interests. American interests are to broaden its outreach in Africa, to broaden its trade, to broaden its influence over the other powers. And now with an increasingly bipolar world, the rise of China, the Ukrainian war, Russia-Ukrainian war, and its attendant effects in the supply chain and currency, international currency. I see America making more and more rapprochement with the government in Kampala, the administration in Kampala. Dr. Kawuma has dwelled much on violence and human rights. Miriam, whom I've interacted with for some time, probably close to a decade or so, will agree with me that when it comes to matters of human rights, I am unflinching. and uncompromising fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms, we all go take a stand, regardless of the side of the political divide we find ourselves. Having said that, he also talked very deeply and passionately about election violence in Uganda. Now, I'd like to make it categorically clear that election violence is a deeply ingrained culture. It's part of the ethos and ethics of the body politic in Uganda. We started election violence in 1961 when Chiwanuka won the election and was made chief minister when we achieved self-government just before independence. Now, in Buganda, where Chiwanuka's DP was the leader, any person who appeared on the ballot paper, not for DP, had difficulty winning and in fact had their properties destroyed. The same thing happened in 1962. 1966, when we did to have an election, you know what happened? We had a revolution where the kingdoms were abolished and one of the kings was sent into exile, packing into exile under a volley of bullets. 1980 is all well too known. It's probably one of the most written on election by historians. 85 was supposed to have an election, it never happened. We had the coup d'etat. Then 89, we had a mini election, not a general election, although expanding the NRC. And some pockets of violence. 1994, CA elections. There was terrible violence in Kampala, Babu and the late Kafumbe Mukasa. In Ntungamo was like a war zone. Ruzindana, Kamwesiga, Rukutana, violence and soldiers deployed. Same thing happened in 96. 2001 is all well documented when Besigye was presented himself for the first time. There was a group of Nyekundire led by generals and Kakoza Mutale beating people, maiming people, promoting, the sitting president. 2006, all too known, Besigye is arrested and increased violence. So, same thing 2020, 2011, 2016, 2021. So it's only the magnitude of the violence that has continued, has increased. But violence is part and parcel of the ethics and ethos of the body politic in Uganda when it comes to elections. Now, it's a whole topic that we could discuss. Now, when it comes to the aspects of human rights that Dr. Kumi seems to be worried about, and I would also be worried because human rights are human rights, and you never know when your turn comes to be at the receiving end of things. Is what I always tell people. I am on a WhatsApp group of generals, and I keep reminding them that they are shouting at us and making fun of we, the so-called human rights defenders. But I always remind them that we've seen generals make those fierce statements, and when their turn comes to be at the receiving end of the stick, they start invoking the very things that they were talking against. Now, the US-Uganda relations, believe me, United States will always follow the same narrative. They get all this information, by the way. If you look at the cables that are written between the US Embassy here and the Department of State, and eventually said Department of Defense if it's to do with intelligence and what have you. There's been a consistent narrative on the deteriorating human rights observance in Uganda. You guys in the States, based in the States, you have access to information. You can always write. I remember, who was this lady in FDC? Mugisha. Was it Ann Mugisha? Is it Ann Mugisha? Yeah, when she was based in the US, she used to regularly write to the State Department asking for cables from Uganda, and they would give her the information. And it showed consistently that they were briefing the State Department, they were briefing Capitol Hill about what was happening in Uganda. Now, for the likes of Kahumi, who seem to be disappointed You can always change tack. These days, there are smarter ways of going about human rights violations. You apply smart sanctions. You go for the persons, the individuals involved in sanctioning, rather in committing these violations. You go for them, you go for their businesses, you go for their business associates, and you go for their families. So the US-Africa Summit and the shining, the parade and the red carpets that were rolled out for the head of state should not in any way cause negativity or concern to them. He's a sitting head of state and is representing interests of those who voted him and those who didn't vote him. I see nothing really contradictory or out of this world on this occasion.
Right. Thank you very much, Edgar, for that. Miriam, we recently saw that the U.S. Secretary of State, and that is Anthony Blinken, kind of took us through the new U.S.-Africa strategy, and this strategy particularly looks at it looks at there's a new shift in its strategy, which breaks from the status quo, which has been, we're focusing on governance, we're focusing on human rights, and if we don't do what we want, we're pulling out our support to the country, blah, blah, blah. But at the core of this strategy is a vision for a 21st century US-African partnership that is motivated by discernible global shifts. Now, these global shifts, you and I know, is that we're looking at climate change. We are looking at economic prosperity for the global world. We are looking also at the competition that exists between the US, China, and Russia for influence in Africa. I mean, if we keep talking human rights, if we keep talking governance as a way to deal with US, are we not losing the focus?
No, we are not losing the focus. I think US well knows that it can deal with Africa. It has always dealt with Africa, even when the CIA was assassinating African leaders, like assisting in the assassination of African leaders like Lumumba. That's how they have always related to Africa. Like Edgar said, it's their interests, and the Africans come next, if not last. Has anything changed? Not really. I think we as Africans, we should focus on how can we influence change towards these countries, the Western countries, the people we call, we look forward to for development. We call them development partners. We should be at the center of defining how to relate with these countries. Are we going to stay subordinates, recipients at the last end of whatever they think is good for us, or it's about what we think is good for us from them? But how do we get there? Like Kawuma said, we are all disappointed by the meeting. But like Edgar said, that meeting is kind of, it has to be there because today it's a global village. African leaders always meet with other leaders, even with the UN General Assembly, even during any other meeting, and those meetings interact. But do they show that US is condoning the abuse of rights going on in Uganda, going on in other African countries? I think US is currently showing that they know the abuse of human rights, but they are putting forward their interests ahead of the people's rights, and it should be like a wake-up call for all of us. But to go back to the relations you've mentioned, the global relations which are changing. How does China relate with Africa, for instance? How does Russia relate with Africa, for instance? Do they care about the people's human rights? No. Is now US trying to copy Russia or China in their relations to Africa? Unfortunately, kind of. So our challenge is, should we sleep and just let them ride over us? Should we let them just fund our dictators and arm them to abuse us more, and as they keep a blind eye. Like Edgar said, they know whatever goes on. If you read the Human Rights Country report of US on Uganda of 2020, it highlights everything that has happened, has gone wrong with the 2021 presidential elections, the 2020 massacres in Kampala, everything. They highlight it even more than Uganda Human Rights Commission. So they know much, they know better. But as they choose development over rights, by the way, we also need the money. It's not like we are saying don't bring the money, because human rights also involves the socioeconomic rights. So as we are fighting against the abuse of people's freedoms, we are also fighting for people to get jobs. We are fighting to alleviate the poverty. We are fighting for education, the health and the public services and etc. But how do we highlight that? How do we show the world that without good governance, without human rights, there can't be development? And whatever you call your interests won't happen if there is violence at home, if there is conflicts. For instance, nobody can comfortably invest in DRC because there is an ongoing conflict. And if you wait and such a conflict come to Uganda, if say tomorrow there is a civil war, there is no way you are going to put in money in such a country. There is no way you are interacting with South Sudan because there is violence. So if these developing countries are like they can just push the rubbish under the carpet and just hold the party on top of that rubbish and wish it off, are they going to benefit from that? No. Are they trying maybe to just wish it away? It won't be wished away. But who is going to really highlight the concern, especially for Ugandans, as Africans, as Ugandans? Our interest should be coming first, and they should be put on the table first. And I think this is the time to stop trusting the politicians so much. I mean, they are the ones to make the decisions, but I would like to call upon my colleagues, the human rights defenders, Helen, Kawuma, Edgar. It's time for people-driven struggles to push for change. If we want to see change, we don't expect, for instance, Museveni to go and talk to Biden and you say, hey, you see, I'm not the best, but we can negotiate A, B, C, D. He's also going to push for his interest, and he has that platform and he's going to use it for his own benefit. But what about us? How do we push our concerns forward? Like Edgar said, there are so many ways these days of how you can champion human rights, and we can do it in a way that it doesn't hurt development. And that development should be people-centered development, not just pushing money into the hands of dictators, which at the end of the day is taken through corruption, and it doesn't even trickle down to the grassroots. So these are the issues, and like we know how the processes work. For instance, Biden can sign off the 55 million to African leaders, but he still has to go through the Congress to get that approval. So we should take our struggle to that level. To the people leaders, the Congress are representatives of Americans. So we should take the struggle to the people. This is a people's struggle, and we take it to the people, and the leaders have to do the abiding of the people. But, and this should be a concerted effort of a united African peoples. For me, I'm a Pan-Africanist, and I always look at a borderless Africa. I would like to see an African in DRC, an African in Kenya joining hands with an African in Uganda and an African in Sudan, pushing for the liberation, for the rights of an African everywhere, whether it's in Kampala, whether it's in Kinshasa, whether it's in Goma or in Khartoum. So it's time to, if we can borrow from the struggle of ANC in South Africa, it's time to embark on grassroots, people-led struggles. And these struggles, in the end, I'm so optimistic, will push the politicians to do the binding of the people.
Right. Helen, recently we saw a new strategy being implemented, the US-Africa strategy, and allow me to stick to it because it shifts away from the former, because it is first of all looking at a US-African partnership. And this is different. It's a different language that marks a departure from initiatives by previous US administrations, because they're emphasizing on listening to the African people, to the African states, and make sure that there is a partnership, an understanding. We are trying, the shifting from them being a world power, but realizing that they cannot be a world power without Africa. So with this new shift, won't we see more of Uganda, particularly, when we see more of US relations focusing on the interests of both parties than the interests of, the figures that are pointing to the issues that Uganda is facing, for example?
Yeah, I wonder how much of the new strategy is really old wine in new bottles, really. The idea of partnering, what does that really mean? I mean, one has to unpack these phrases, partnering directly with Africa, because you're not partnering with Africans if these countries aren't, except where there's democracy. If the people in charge of these countries are not the representatives that people genuinely chose, you're not partnering with African people, you're partnering with African leaders. And they, some of whom rule with an iron fist and don't represent the views of their people at all. So that's troubling. And I haven't seen any change in anywhere, really, not just with respect to Uganda, but with respect to any African country, really, except really more of the same. It's not as though the United States hasn't prioritized defense, hasn't prioritized business relations with African countries in the past. Of course, they have. But it's just, there might have been a little slack during the Trump years, but that's always been the case, that has been, those things have been the priorities. And governance, democracy, and human rights, just the basics of that have not really, except in countries that don't matter very much, that don't have natural resources, that don't have strong armies, that aren't geostrategically positioned the way Uganda is. I mean, Uganda being kind of at the edge of bordering, in the past Sudan and so on, being so close to Congo where all the loot is very, very strategically placed. And so therefore, that's democracy has never, human rights have never been an issue there. And one of the excuses kind of used is really one of the ones, I mean, Edgar, you're right. Nice to meet you. That there has been election violence has been a feature of Ugandan politics for a very, very long time. Part of it in the early days was the trauma of colonialism and also the trauma of being kind of jammed into one country. I mean, we're having our own problems with ethnic diversity and governance in the United States right now. I mean, we know how hard it is to actually get people from different backgrounds to really work together towards a common goal and to have a common shared identity. But the U.S. was, populated over a long period of time and has had huge human rights struggles, which we're still having and haven't stopped. And so Uganda never had a chance to go through that process of identity formation, really. So, there were bound to be problems, as there haven't been in many other countries whose boundaries were drawn by people other than the people who lived in them. But that doesn't give the United States an excuse to just sort of say, well, whatever we do, there's going to be violence, so let's just stick with Museveni. That does not make sense. There's no justification for that. That is, violence is always wrong, no matter who's committing it and who's abetting it. It's always wrong. So this kind of slack, I mean, really, one can only attribute this kind of casual acceptance of not only the torture of individual Ugandans, by the military, which is directly controlled by the leadership, by the way, but the torture of members of parliament who are representing thousands and thousands of people. That's grotesque. And that is not, I don't understand why the United States continues to partner with a leader that does that. I don't know where that's happening elsewhere on the continent right now. It's happened in the past, but boy. And it's not as though countries that also have had violence in the past necessarily always have it. I mean, we've seen, most of the rest of the continent, except for the Great Lakes, is at peace right now. There just isn't only conflict in this kind of dictator, among the East and Central African dictatorships, and it's very, very disturbing. Finally, the other argument that can be made is that Museveni has consistently undermined U.S. interests in Central Africa since the beginning. We didn't want to see a genocide in Rwanda, and yet Museveni backed the rebels who helped spark it. We didn't want to see chaos in Congo, and yet Museveni sparked that mayhem. He's stealing all of our development aid, giving us a very, very bad name, allowing, for example, hundreds of millions just during the COVID period, hundreds of millions of dollars in COVID money, for example, to disappear into his military, which then tortured and killed civilians. So, none of this is really in our interest. I don't really get it. And I don't see why that, I think it's extremely, part of the problem with our Africa policy is that Africa is this huge continent with all of these different countries in it. And when people, we have turnover in the State Department, the Defense Department, and so on, and there really isn't any kind of consistent expertise on these countries. And so people are sort of given these kind of boilerplate talking points, and they don't really understand deeply the countries that they're dealing with or the personalities that they're dealing with in these countries. And decisions are made accordingly based on ignorance and immediate self-interest, what seems like self-interest, but really isn't.
Right. Thank you, Helen. Right. Daniel, recently the Secretary of State, Lincoln, he said the United States knows that on most of the urgent challenges and opportunities we face, Africa will make the difference. We cannot achieve our goals around the world, whether that's ending the COVID-19 pandemic, building a strong and inclusive global economy, combating climate change crisis, or revitalizing a democracy and defending human rights, without the leadership of African governments, institutions, and citizens. Now, the US States family believes that it is time to stop treating Africa as a subject of geopolitics and start treating it as a major geopolitical player it has become. Now, with us focusing on the human rights, of course, which is usually the case, and regardless, I see that the US is going to, focus on its interests, regardless of whatever situation there is in whatever country. Now, Daniel, really, shouldn't we be rallying our people, for example, Ugandans, shouldn't we be rallying our people to focus on our own interests as well, instead of looking to the US to be the hero here?
Thank you for that question. The issue is that our people don't have a voice. If our people had a voice, then you'll be able to come up with a people-centered approach or policy towards the United States. But our people are so desperate right now. I was in the UAE in November and walked on the streets of Dubai, and I found Ugandans sleeping on the streets. These are Ugandans who are seeking opportunities abroad, lining up for just any way of making a living. So if you look at right now the desperation among the masses in Uganda, people are trying to flee the continent because the conditions are not ideal. After 37 years leadership. And I was looking at, there's somebody who made a photo of President Museveni shaking the hands of US presidents all the way from Ronald Reagan to President Biden. And that picture alone could show you what's wrong with US foreign policy towards not only Uganda, but Africa in general, because they keep doing the same thing over and over again, and they expect different results. But if you look at the trends in Uganda, we have pretty much one of the youngest populations. The economic should be booming, really, if we had a leadership and governance structure that catered for the needs of the Ugandan people. But instead, you have masses of Ugandans. Right now, if you're trying to go to the US Embassy to apply for a visa, they're going to give you a 1-year waiting time because people are trying to leave the country. Like the UAE is even struggling, changing their own policies, and other Middle Eastern countries towards their tourist visas, because Ugandans are trying to flee in large numbers because the economy in Uganda is not working for the people. And just focusing in on the economic aspect of it, I was looking at the pledge of 55 billion by the United States over the next 3 years. The United States has spent 54 billion in Ukraine the last few months, 54 billion. And they're offering the continent of Africa 55 billion over the next 3 years. So in my opinion, I don't see a serious commitment to actually develop and invest in Africa. And I think Helen touched on this. If Biden is gone in 2024 and you have Trump, do you think this policy is going to remain the way it is? So there's a lack of long-term strategy and approach towards Africa and Uganda in general, because the US is mostly focused on short-term. And that's why they always prop up dictatorships in Uganda, because Biden doesn't want, after what's going on in Ukraine, he doesn't want an escalation of a situation happening in East Africa. And how does he go about it? Is like, I better back the big man or the strong man in the region so that I don't have chaos the remaining 3 years of my administration. So if you look at every single American leader over the years, their focus has always been on the short-term interest of that administration. There's a lack of long-term approach. And I believe even when you look through the new sub-Saharan approach, most of the issues that are highlighted, supporting civil society, human rights organizations, transparency, does anyone see that happening in Uganda? I mean, right now, if you're operating an NGO in Uganda or you're part of civil society, I mean, it's a life or death situation. We see even people like respected lawyers like Mr. Opio and others, they are really struggling to even do what they do for backing the Ugandan people. So it's very difficult to look at this policy on paper and think it's going to be applicable in our own setting. And the only way to do it is by sending a statement that maybe the United States should be working with only governments that are showing commitment towards democracy and human rights. That could be an approach. You send a message and say, we're going to have a summit, but these are the preconditions the countries we invite have to set these conditions in place. There may be people will show that will think that you are serious and you have a more long-term approach towards the policy of US in Africa. And like Helen said, we have to look at this issue from the perspective of the regional conflicts. Obviously, we have the situation of AMISOM. We have seen what's going on in Congo. We have seen what's going on in Sudan. Museveni has had fingerprints on all those conflicts, but for some reason, he finds a way of coming out like he's the hero, like he's the one who is managing the situation. He's putting boots on the ground, which the United States doesn't want to do these days. So he has managed to play the game well in the hands of the Western prejudice that Africans cannot manage themselves, that you need a strong man to manage these regimes. So overall, that's the challenge I see in this policy. Of course, I don't want to come off that we are against development in Africa, that we are against investors coming to our country, because we understand the economic situation many of our brothers and sisters are facing. People are trying to flee looking for jobs. But our argument is that how do you create conditions in Uganda that are conducive to prosperity and economic development? That starts with democracy. That starts with freedom of expression. That comes with Ugandans having the right to speech, the right to engage in social media without being prosecuted. We see laws being passed, such as the Computer Misuse Act, targeting just speech. Facebook being blocked in Uganda, which is an opportunity for young people to promote their businesses, among other things. So I think overall, if Uganda, instead of focusing on the approach of coming here to these summits and sitting down with companies and trying to attract business to Uganda, if you set the preconditions in Uganda for peace, democracy, you're going to attract investors in the country. But at the moment, I don't see anyone who is serious about doing business in Uganda committing their resources to our country, because they see the unpredictability of the politics in Uganda. What's going to happen after Museveni? If you ask yourself that question, you know, is it the general who is tweeting online every day who is going to be next in line? Who is going to be the next person taking over? And if you're an investor and saying, I want to invest $1 billion in Uganda, do you know what the political situation is going to be after Museveni? So that lack of certainty in our country, I believe, is what's affecting prosperity, and the numbers do not lie. If you try to measure the level of development, job creation, most of it has been set back by the politics and the issue of poor governance in our country.
Right, talking about poor governance, I think recently the president was asked what they focused on during the summit, and he was very, clear. He said that we are focusing on investment, trade, tourism, and security cooperation, and of course anti-terrorism. None of which includes human rights violations, none of which includes, improving the state of democracy in the country. Edgar Tabaro, with Museveni and the entire government in the his team in the US, focusing on investment, trade, tourism, and security cooperation, as well as anti-terrorism, is he deviating, or is he focusing on the issues that really, really matter to the people of Uganda?
Yeah, if I maybe bounce back that to you, what are the matters? What are the issues that matter to Ugandans?
I mean, everybody's talking about Uganda human rights, the violations, without defending them, without upholding human rights, then we're not bound to move forward as a country.
I think it's much bigger than that, and I would like to look at the abuse of human rights in isolation, in isolation from the well-being, the living conditions of the people. We've had sustained economic growth for the last 30 or so years, and with economic growth, we've created a few very wealthy individuals who have grabbed land and dispossessed certain sections of the society from access to land. And you can imagine when the NRM government took power in 1986, Uganda's urban population was about 11.5%. It's more than doubled. We are about at 26-27% of the population. So we have persons who have increasingly been dispossessed of the land. They move to the urban areas, and when they move to the urban areas, they can't find employment, and therefore live on the margins of life. Now, these persons have taken to political agitation, and there is a development that is rather unsettling. Some sections of the political elite believe there are only two ways Museveni can be removed from power. He either be recalled by his creator, or he's forced out through an insurrection or an armed resistance. Now, that dynamic is what has led to, for instance, increased abductions, increased kidnappings, and detentions in ungazetted areas. So However, our constitution has robust procedures, robust provisions for enforcement of fundamental human rights. And I practice law in the courts of the Republic of Uganda. We have a robust judiciary, and we have some independent-minded judges sitting in these courts. So obtaining redress, obtaining remedies should come as a consequence of these abuses. But increasingly, I see human rights activists, defenders of human rights, taking more to activism, raising rage, and not going for the due process. And I think that is a very worrying development. Now, if you look at the last 30 years, America-Uganda relations, particularly under the Democrats, Ambassador Johnny Carson, who served in Uganda in the 90s, later in Nairobi, and I think became, was he Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and I think was under Obama. And I see his comeback under Joe Biden, as I think he's in charge of that fund that has been set for Africa. Carson understands this region very well. He understands Uganda very well. In fact, for the time he served at the Brookings Institute, he was very, very, very critical. He was a critic of Museveni's administration, Museveni's style of governance, and its related implications in the region. However, whenever he joins government, he does a 360 degrees U-turn and becomes pro-Museveni and treats Uganda as he treats Uganda as probably one of America's best allies in the region. So the question I ask time and again, what are those American interests that are critical, that may be at variance with what Helen is talking about? So then on the aspect of the investment, Dr. Kawuma was saying that no serious investment can happen. Well, I've not seen many American companies come here, the so-called Fortune 500. Simple reason being that maybe the political risk, the risk analysis on the side of politics is considered too risky. For those companies to come and set up here. But from this tour of the United States, from this visit from the United States, I think there is a takeaway of about 4.5 or 5 billion US dollars of an American entity that is going to invest in the refinery here in Uganda. I think that's quite a chunk of money to invest for FDI in Uganda. I mean, we've not had such big FDI from America in the region in a very long time. This should be about the biggest to be penned. Not all is gloom. I don't want to talk about the other aspects like the plurality that Kawuma was talking about. I would rather concentrate on the core issues, and not all spell doom, and also continue to emphasize that the things that we're asking for will not fall from the sky. We've got to be purposeful, we've got to be intentional, and we've got to be deliberate in pursuing them. We have to be unflinching, and we've got to deploy all resources at our within our reach for us to achieve that purpose. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you for that. Miriam, we've had quite a lot from Helen, from Daniel, from Edgar, but still we are not seeing how the US-Africa relations are going to go past, first of all, our past, look at our past and what we have been doing as a country, but also look at how best to, improve the situation. we are all still focusing on mostly our interests. Now, if President Museveni goes to the US, certainly the conversation is not going to be, oh, you are violating human rights, or you're doing ABCD. They're going to, sit down and have diplomatic conversations and not focus on anything that he's being accused of. Uh, what voices or what works or what ways are we going to have to see work being done in that regard?
Maybe first of all is we need to have faith and trust ourselves that even without US support, even without other countries giving us a hand, we ourselves, we can push for change and achieve it. We need to assure Ugandans that they need themselves, that they themselves are the people to liberate themselves. And the moment other people see you are determined, that you know what you want and you are determined to achieve it, they will always come to your side, no matter what. And we have had examples. Museveni with NRA almost pushed the struggle single-handedly. We've had, I give an example of ANC, but we can also look at our neighbor in Kenya. Kenya had to struggle with a dictatorship, also post-independence politics were dictatorial and violent. And they struggled with that and until people stood up, all people, the civil society, the academia, the business community, and the grassroots people stood up and pushed the dictatorship outside. And even with setbacks of electoral violence in 2007, they've been able to come back up and fight for their democracy. And so far, they are doing well. Edgar said that the Fortune 500 countries cannot come to Uganda, but they are coming to Kenya. Even in a few days to come, they have a big international IT conference. They've had so many investors coming in there to invest because there is a stability, there is predictability as far as their political future is concerned. And that's what we need in Uganda today. And how do we achieve that? I think if we borrow a leaf from those countries that are neighboring us, like Kenya, I think we can assure Ugandans to see that they themselves can push for change and achieve it. Edgar also mentioned that people so far have given up on how else they can change the status quo. Like say, they think Museveni has either to go out naturally after death, as Mugabe did, or something like that. But let me assure you, Edgar, I think there is always hope. There are even examples to show that. If you look at Sudan, the People's Revolution in Sudan, the women-led revolution, the grassroots revolution, came from within, and it's they themselves that pushed Bashir out. And the same thing can happen in Uganda. There is nothing special that those people have that we don't have. They used the internet to mobilize, we have it. They were fighting a militaristic dictatorship like we have in Uganda, but they succeeded. And no amount of military force can defeat the people, the people who are determined to fight for change. And nobody touched them. They were able to walk on the street. They were able to demand for change, and they got it. So we can use such examples to inspire Ugandans to aspire for change. And the moment other people see that we are determined to fight for change in our country, they will also follow change. Like Kawuma said, for me, I'm not so optimistic about the US support or Western countries' support of the struggle for the people back in Uganda. I'm not. And history has proven that. Those people simply, they would work with a dictatorship until it's falling there. Then when it falls, they just wait for the next government in power. Unless in countries where they physically came up and pushed for regime change, like in Iraq, like in Libya, and we also saw the consequences. So we wouldn't need that happening in Uganda or any other African country. So it's upon us. It's upon us to fight for the struggle. And like Aria mentioned, we need to look beyond the governments to see who to ally to. There are so many people movements in USA, for instance, who are pro-human rights, who are so committed to change, who are so committed to see the restoration of the dignity of Africans, who are committed to see that they are fighting for the common man. So there are such a groups, and those are the groups we need to ally with. And such a groups in the end they are the taxpayers, they can determine where their money goes. Helen had mentioned that most of the time, some of the leaders in USA made decisions without knowing the consequences. For instance, will the Congress know how the $55 billion they are going to spend in Africa? How will they be spent? Who is going to end up with the pocket of that cash? So the moment we highlight that, who's going to take the money? Are they going to first sustain that there are structures on ground to absorb that money and divest it to the people who should be the recipients? And once we point out that the money they are throwing around is going to end up in the wrong hands and maybe foster the wrong consequences of harassing people more, maybe they'll end up in buying more guns that are going to torture more Ugandans. If we push, like Kawuma said, that the money should be tagged with conditions for human rights sustenance, for human rights respect in those countries that are going to receive that funding, I think we can move a step forward. I'm not saying it's the only way forward, but I think it can bring some impact because every African leader needs investment, and Uganda definitely needs that money for investment. Even the money which has been already approved for oil, nobody's going to put money in a country where the political future is uncertain. So the moment you show them that, you see, if you really want to bring your money and you want to make profit or you want to invest for long term, you have to ensure political stability, you have to ensure good governance, you have to ensure that the government structures and the public service and the leadership, the democracy is working so that your money can bring you profit or can benefit the people you intend to benefit. I think they will also wake up and listen.
Thank you, indeed. Helen, as we get into our last round of the conversation, as we wind up on this conversation, we need to now focus on then what we need to, because it looks like we are not going to see any change, because as Miriam says, with whatever administration comes in, they'll still be focused on their interests in Africa. Even Africa itself will still be focused on what benefits them, on perhaps being in leadership forever. Who knows? Because now, what do we focus on? How do we, with the US-Africa relations, US-Uganda relations, how do we harness those relations to really focus on our people and improve the situation at hand?
Thanks for that question. Obviously, that's a question for Ugandans themselves to decide. But I know what I hope they would decide, which is to keep up the struggle. It's a difficult one. And this movement is quite young, actually. I was at a demonstration about 10 years ago in front of the UN when Museveni was speaking there in September, at the UN meetings. And there were about 6 of us there. And now, there's sometimes hundreds at these gatherings. And there are events like this. There are, there's a wonderful movement that has evolved, and it's not only speaking out, but it's trying to help people who are victims of the regime with whatever support they need, medical assistance, legal assistance, and so on. I would hate to see that flag just because of the discouraging moves that the United States has made. Now is not the time to give up. It's absolutely the time to keep the pressure up. And that means, to continue following things as closely as possible, educating ourselves about everything that's going on, and making sure that our leaders, not just congressmen, Congress representatives, and so on, and senators, know about the situation in Uganda and how upsetting it is, but also even local leaders at the grassroots level, anyone who's part of a political party, Democrat or Republican, what's going on is absolutely disgusting. It boils down to really everything boils down, I think, in some sense, to the human body, and what's happening to the bodies of Ugandans is outrageous. And it's, our support for the regime is a mark of our lack of civilization here in the United States, I think. And it really needs, we need to keep talking about that all the time. I also wanted to quickly respond to some of the things that Edgar said. Thank you for your remarks, Edgar. It is true that often there will be this response that the Ugandan economy has grown dramatically over the years, but on the other hand, it still remains somehow one of the 20 poorest countries in the world, according to the IMF. So maybe the economic growth isn't quite so huge. Maybe we're being misled about those statistics. I'm not sure, or maybe the money is just being grabbed by a certain small number of people who we all know. The World Bank on its website, I don't know when the last time I checked, said only 20% of Ugandans fell under the poverty line. But that's absurd, because at the same time, the statistics also show that 70% of Ugandans live on less than $2 a day. Now, the official poverty line is $1.25, but if you go up to the $2 a day level, which is unsurvivable, basically, I don't know how these people manage. And the people below $5 a day is practically everybody, except for a tiny, tiny elite. Most of the money that actually goes into that figure of high economic growth, at least according to a study that I saw a while ago, is actually the US government pumping money into NGOs and creating a kind of small middle class through that. So this isn't, Museveni is not the kind of master economic free marketeer, gardener that he is sometimes portrayed as. There is, very little. I mean, the economy was much more robust, I'm afraid, in the 60s under Obote. And the health system was actually stronger under Idi Amin than it is now. There has been urban growth, but that's not a good sign. That's a sign of how people are suffering in rural areas. That's a sign of the underinvestment in agricultural development. It's a sign of the unfair terms of trade that farmers have to put up with, so that they barely earn anything for the crops that they grow. And it's a sign of land grabbing, which is really scary and goes on with absolute impunity. So I don't think it's anything to brag about that there's urban growth in Uganda. It's chaotic. There's also this question of whether Ugandans who have been abused by the regime, for example, should resort to the courts more often than trying to take to the streets or through activism. The courts, unfortunately, if there's any political wrinkle in a case, as there so often is, cannot be relied on to deliver a fair judgment. Otherwise, the judges will face intimidation or worse. And I've seen that over and over and over again. I've been studying Ugandan politics for 30 years, and it's just heartbreaking to see. So the courts are really, unfortunately, as brilliant as some of the judges are, admittedly, they have their hands tied. And even, whether it comes to elections, whether it comes to election violence, whether it comes to anything with any political aspect to it, economic crimes and so on. And finally, it is true that Johnny Carson, who has been an expert on and has been an ambassador all around Eastern Africa for a long, long time, knows the region and its history extremely well, has sometimes said absolutely right on things about the situation in Uganda and other countries. And yet, I don't know why he doesn't understand what's going on and why it's so wrong. I would love to ask him that question. I have tried to approach him on several occasions. I encourage others to try because he doesn't seem to want to talk about it. So would love to chat to him. So if you know him, Edgar, please link us up.
Welcome to the world of diplomacy.
For sure.
Very fickle allies.
Right. Now to you, Daniel and Edgar. Let's start with Daniel first. We are going to continue having this conversation, certainly, over calling upon our leaders to, of course, value our human rights and defend them in particular. But it won't take away the fact that most of these have their interests, they will forever, ride on their own interests. Now, to you, Daniel, particularly as a new leader, you are the people who have, raised the voice against violence against human rights in Uganda and calling on the international community to really take heed and take some sort of action against it. But from the look of things, it remains still, you go and make the noise and it is still the status quo is maintained. How do we move? What will you do eventually at the end of the day? Because you're still going to go on the streets, protest, and nothing.
Yeah, so thank you so much. We're going to continue with the struggle. So that's not going to stop. And until we believe the country is liberated. From all purposes, we believe as National Unity Platform that the Museveni regime is not going to deliver anything more for the Ugandan people. They have had 37 years and the results speak for themselves. Like Helen has explained, Uganda is still one of the poorest country in the world. Uganda has failed to create jobs for their people. And as the new policy is to ship out educated Ugandans to go and work as nannies in the Middle East and other countries because they cannot contain the rising tide of young people in Uganda. So several solutions on the way forward. We believe empowering our institutions is critical because right now the institutions have been decimated in Uganda, from the judiciary, like Helen has explained, to the parliament. You cannot rely on, they have all been infiltrated by the regime. And for the purposes of long-term optics for Uganda, that's always the challenge and the gimmick of these long-serving leaders. They tell you that they are going to offer stability in the country. And like Edgar mentioned, the marginal economic gains, that's always their selling pitch. But when you ask them what happens next, and that's, if you look at Libya, Egypt, and all the other countries which had long-serving leaders, where institutions have been decimated, because the institutions are the core of every structure, because they hold the country together. When the big man leaves or when the president leaves, you have those institutions. But right now, even Uganda, new media outlets are really talking about the president's son being as the de facto replacement. There's no talk about Uganda's institutions determining who the next leader is, because the institutions have been decimated completely. So we're going to continue fighting for the empowerment of the institutions in Uganda, because we believe that's the only way to guarantee long-term stability. Equal justice under the law is very crucial. We have talked about even members of parliament being held in jail without trial for over a year. If a member of parliament, just imagine in the United States having a member of Congress locked up in jail without trial for a whole year. I mean, that's the scenario we find ourselves in Uganda. If MPs can be locked up, what about average civilians? So definitely the justice system is unjust and has failed to offer equal justice under the law in Uganda. We strongly believe investing in civil society and non-profit organization will help, at least on the grassroots, because the government has failed to deliver. We have seen so many development programs, that have been implemented by government that have failed. So I think the bedrock right now is relying on non-profit civil society, especially to tap into the resources that are coming from the Western countries. We are going to continue advocating for open society, freedom of speech, freedom of association, a free media, because those voices cannot be silenced. That's the only way we can succeed as human rights advocates, by our voices being able to go out. You'll be surprised how intimidated Ugandans are, even in the diaspora. Just going to a protest in Washington, D.C., you could invite a Ugandan, they'll say, oh, I'm afraid for my family back home. If they see my pictures protesting in Washington, D.C., they might retaliate on my people back home. So Ugandans are living in fear wherever they are. Even in the diaspora, you can think that people have left Uganda and they are expressing themselves freely there, but people are scared for their life, for their families, even abroad. People are asking, oh, how come there are not thousands and millions of Ugandans pouring in the streets in Washington, D.C. when Museveni visited? It's because people are afraid. They don't want their pictures taken, and their families are retaliated. We saw what happened to journalist Bahati. I mean, when just from what she did, and they targeted her family. So there's that fear among the Ugandan populace to express themselves, and that's something which we are going to continue to fight for, to make sure that there's that freedom, that liberty for Ugandans to enjoy their civil liberties. Of course, the issue of elections, we touched on that. That's really the only way you can guarantee long-term stability. If you see the countries that have been able to have some marginal success in Africa, they have been able to have some kind of power change. Even our East African neighbors are doing a little bit better job in Tanzania, Kenya, in having some form of power change, however imperfect it is. It at least gives you some long-term stability.
Dr. Kawuma, you would add Burundi too.
Oh, exactly.
Which used to be a rogue state. It has surpassed us in that aspect.
Yeah.
They've changed leadership.
Because
transition.
However powerful Museveni might think he is, if you fail to put the country on a path of a peaceful power change, that's a failure to me. And if whatever he has fought for, or as he claims, if he had put Ugandan on that path, I think most people would support him. But at this point, it's very clear that his mandate was not to liberate Ugandans like he claimed. We're going to continue pressuring stakeholders. State Department, we're going to continue going there to put pressure on them. And there's been a little bit of an engagement with the diaspora. And we've been talking to these folks at most of the meetings we have been going to, that you need to involve the diaspora in executing some of these programs. Because when you involve us, the African diaspora, the Ugandan diaspora, to implement some of these programs, like Miriam talked about, you are more likely to have it more targeted to the people who actually need these resources in Africa. So we're going to continue pushing that to make sure that the Ugandan diaspora and African diaspora in general is involved in the process of all of these programs, foreign direct investment aid that is going to Africa. United States interest will always be their national interest. I believe right now they look at Uganda as a mercenary state. That's really my opinion on that. So the issue is, how do we transform that to make sure it's about the interests of the Ugandan people? When you look at the policy they are laying out of involving the young population, renewable energies, I think when you look at Museveni's focus on oil, I think even the oil states right now are trying to transition from oil, because that's not the future. The future is in renewable energies. And I think that's the pitch we need to make to these stakeholders, that the younger population of Uganda, the only way to create jobs and opportunity for them is by investing more in these renewable sources of energy, by investing more in the technology and the innovative ways in which to create opportunities for our people. So I think that's a stronger argument than the argument Museveni is putting forward of saying he's the strong man that is going to stabilize the region. So, but overall, as I summarize my message, the struggle continues. We are determined more than ever. Many Ugandan people want change. Many Ugandans want change. Many might be silent behind the scenes, but it's very clear that that the temperature or the pulse of the communities that Most people believe Museveni is not the future for our country, and we want change. We want younger leadership. We want leaders who understand the needs of the Ugandan people, leaders who are going to create opportunities for our young people. And this development has to happen from within. Yes, we appreciate the support of our Western allies, but this is going to be eventually determined by the African people and by the Ugandan people. So the issue is for the Western governments getting out of the way of that organic movement. When they keep funding militarily our regimes, they empower them. They put more money in their bank accounts. So if they can focus more on growing the people from the grassroots, empowering women, empowering our young men in schools through better education, creating more opportunities in the grassroots, I believe that is we are going to emerge with a population that is more enlightened, that loves their country, and that's going to demand the democratic rights and values of our people. So overall, I think that's the best way forward. The US-Africa Summit was a disappointment, but we're going to continue pushing forward and demand that the diaspora is engaged and they focus and target that investment towards the younger population and the core of African society. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel. Edgar, Tabaro, I was reading here, and they were saying that the softer tone in relations between the US and Africa has been noticeable, and this is particularly in the recent business summit that ended. But they're quick to note that it does not necessarily mean the US is abandoning its engagement to the principles of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Now, it is incumbent on African leaders to decide whether to commit to the relationship and how they will best look after these interests. Moving forward, Edgar, what do we do?
Moving forward in what regard? Observance of human rights?
In this whole conversation we've had, US-Uganda relations, but also noting that in as much as during the summit they never talked about the principles of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, African leaders ought to, if they need to benefit from the US, they ought to, look back at how to deal with this.
Lynn, America is a fickle ally in as far as deepening governance, deepening rule of the law, deepening observance of human rights. They pander to the rogue regimes in the region. I mean, there is a neighboring country that has been mentioned over and over again in UN reports, in this and that is exporting instability to the DRC. Secretary Blinken went on phone and called that president and reading the Riot Act. But the red carpet was rolled out for him. The red carpet was rolled out for him. So if the likes of Dr. Kawuma, my sister Miriam, myself, and you are going to count on US to cause the change that we want, that is not going to happen. Yes, it's critical that we do engage the United States in diplomatic maneuvers, diplomatic endeavors, also to serve the cause of the Ugandan people, but we should not entirely rely on them. It's entirely upon us Ugandans. Is this the last submission I'm making, dear Lynn? Yeah, sure. We have had outstanding issues right from independence, the run up to independence, all through independence up to today. There were two commissions that were instituted by the Secretary for Colonies in the run up to Ugandan, the granting Ugandan independence. I think that there was Master Commission, and the other, the Wild Commission. All of Master and the Wild Commission, Uganda Relations Report. The sticking issues that arose at the time are still very relevant to this day. Just a little bit of dynamics in that there are more dispossessed people here and maybe changing dates and names, but we just have to go to some of those documents, update them, edit them, update them, and implement the recommendations. One of the recommendations being having a national dialogue not having a national dialogue. Dialogue. I'm certain you cannot achieve consensus without dialogue. And we should never cease to dialogue, whatever the circumstances. And as it said in Kiswahili, depende tusipende, the Bobby Wines of this world are going to continue being a headache for the elite on the other side, unless and until they sit down in the same room on a round table and thrash out the issues and address the issues of those marginalized persons that have given rise to the likes of the Bobby Wines of this world. So it's dialogue and more dialogue. And very lastly, I am a late, Helen, this is going to shock you. I'm a late and rather reluctant convert to violence, to political violence as a means for causing change where dialogue has been closed out. I must emphasize late and reluctant convert.
Right. Thank you very much, Edgar. Miriam, as we conclude, we cannot continue really having a conversation that maybe they're not listening to. Do we need to tweak that conversation? Do we need to look inward as a country? Talk to the likes of Bobby Wine and, of course, Dr. Daniel, Tim, from going away from Uganda and focusing on our foreign partners, but rather look inward, come back to Uganda and steer the conversation towards a change of things from our human rights abuses, especially, and governance.
One thing to note is that whether you are in the ruling party, whether you are in power today, whether you are in opposition, what we need as Ugandans is all almost the same. We all need a peaceful, stable, developed Uganda. And so having a common interest, we should rally around that to lobby for human rights, for the things that we lack today, good governance, democracy. And like you said, yeah, we really need to push and hold both parties accountable. I mean, the government in Kampala and the US government in Washington. For instance, they mentioned that one of their objectives for US-Africa Summit is, number 2 of the objectives is to ensure democracy and human rights in Africa. They also list human peace and security. They also list environmental concerns, but how do you achieve all that without stable governments in Africa? How do you achieve that without good governance, without transparency, without accountability, without infrastructure on the ground? So what I see really in between is that this is a US-like kind of all of a sudden kind of like a patched up approach towards Africa. I think they are rushing in to just put out some sort of what they look like a fire from China and other investors that have been working with Africans. So it's like half thought out. It doesn't point out the details. It has no clear chart how it's gonna be implemented, and I think a lot still needs to be done, and that's how we should come in and really emphasize the issues that matter. That's when we should come in and say, hey, if you really want this is the way to go about it. And Africans are not just a vacuum that you come in and push in and dump in whatever you want to dump in for your interest. We are people and we also have interests, and those interests should be put at the centerfold of whatever is going to happen into Africa. We have to lead the narrative, we have to lead in the interest, and we have to determine how this has to be done as Africans. And if the leaders are not representing us, yeah, we have to amplify people's voices in a different way through academia, through civil societies and other groups, but make sure that our voices are there and they are heard. Edgar pointed out, I think we need to remind them of their earlier commitments. Uganda badly needs a dialogue if we are to salvage our country politically, if we are to salvage our future, and not just sit back and look on as everything disintegrate. We really need a national dialogue to chart the way forward politically, economically, and even socially. Today, we see people fighting each other based on ethnic groups and all those conflicts, and they are magnifying day after day. And if you really put your ear on ground, you feel the tension is increasing on ground, and that's not good for us. We've seen our neighborhood countries being destroyed by such tendencies, and we don't want that to come to Africa. If the leaders can't be accountable, then it's time we get other leaders. And like Edgar said, I mean, all means, I think, are justified if the peaceful means are not allowed to do the needful. I know this is kind of like tiring, like Helen said, the People's Revolution, that it's recent that Ugandans are coming up in diaspora to stand up and lobby for justice. I mean, the voices have been there, but they have increased of recent, because that also shows like how Africa is developing. Today, we have all Africans in diaspora in all different places, but we also have a large number of Africans, of Ugandans in diaspora who are like economic refugees, who are there not because they want to be there, but they are pushed out there, and those people are really hurting, and they need to be heard. But how do we make our voices heard? That's our homework. How do we make our voices heard by these people? This money we see US pushing into Africa is taxpayers' money, American taxpayers. Even if it's UK taxpayers. And even if it's China, I mean, even China's pay taxes. I don't think China is like that kind of black, dark dictatorship that they point it out to be. I think there are people there who care about how their money is spent and who is it benefiting, where it ends up to. And all those people should be held accountable. We should try to be at the center of anything happening to Africa. We need to put the people back at the front line. Our constitution says power belongs to the people, but in practice, the people have been taking the backstage, and that's how US is treating us. It's treating us like others. You know, we don't matter. Otherwise, these processes should have consulted the people first before they even go to the leaders. But they push us. They think they can just determine what is good for us. It's upon us now to push back and state what is good for us and how we want it to be done in a way that benefits us.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you very much, Miriam. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Daniel and Edgar, for your time this evening, but also this morning for those of you in the US. And Miriam, this has been a very interesting conversation. I hope we can soon focus also on the likely relations between now the China, Russia. I mean, it's a scramble for partition. Uganda is like rather Africa is like a bride, you know, that everyone is, you know, scrambling for. So we need to also come to a point where we can discuss how best their interests also, you know, uplift our own interests in a way. But I thank you and I wish you the very best of the holidays. We'll catch you again, I hope, sometime soon. And God bless you.